The message had to reach Fort Defiance before dawn. It was the autumn of 1863, and the situation in the canyon country of what is now northeastern Arizona was deteriorating faster than the Army's communication lines could track. A column of soldiers under the command of Kit Carson was moving through Navajo territory in a campaign that would end months later, with the forced removal of thousands of Navajo people on what history remembers as the Long Walk. But in the autumn of 1863, the campaign was still in motion and information was everything. A young Army lieutenant named David Foster had been tasked with getting a message to the fort. The message was urgent. The route between his current position and Fort Defiance crossed approximately 40 miles of canyon terrain, the broken, layered, extraordinarily complex landscape of the Colorado Plateau, where the ground did not simply rise and fall but opened without warning into vertical drops of hundreds of feet, where trails that appeared on no map switched back across ledges barely wide enough for a single man, and where a person who did not know the land could walk confidently toward a cliff edge that was invisible until they were standing on it. Foster estimated the journey would take his best rider 2 full days on horseback, assuming the horse could navigate the canyon trails at all, which was not guaranteed. He asked his commanding officer whether a courier could be sent ahead by a different route to save time. His commanding officer told him to speak to the Navajo scouts attached to the column. Foster found the scouts at the edge of the camp. He explained the situation. One of them, an older man whose name Foster recorded only as Hashka, listened, asked 2 questions about the specific content of the message and whether it needed to be written or could be carried verbally, and then told Foster that the message would reach Fort Defiance by the following morning. Foster did not believe him. He said so directly. The older man did not argue. He simply turned and spoke quietly to a younger man standing nearby, a runner perhaps 20 years old, lean in the particular way of someone whose body has been shaped entirely by the demands placed on it, and the young man listened, nodded, and moved off into the canyon darkness at a pace that seemed to Foster almost casual. The message reached Fort Defiance before dawn. Foster wrote about it in his field journal that night, before he knew the outcome, and then added a second entry the following morning when confirmation arrived. In the second entry, he described his own reaction with a frankness that is rare in military correspondence from the period. He wrote that he had no framework for understanding what he had witnessed. He understood horses and he understood riders and he understood terrain. What he did not understand was how a man on foot, alone in the dark in country that his own experienced scouts refused to travel at night, had crossed 40 miles of canyon terrain faster than he believed was physically possible. He spent the next 3 years trying to find the answer. This video is that answer. If this is the kind of history that makes you stop and think, knowledge so precise it looked like something else entirely, make sure you are subscribed. There is a lot more of this coming and you do not want to miss it. To understand why the Army was so baffled by the Navajo messengers, you need to understand how the Army itself moved through the canyon country of the Colorado Plateau, and how limited that movement was compared to what the terrain actually allowed for people who knew it. The U.S. Army of the 1860s was built for a different landscape. Its doctrine, its equipment, its assumptions about movement and supply and communication had been developed for the terrain of the eastern seaboard and the open plains, environments where roads could be built, where horses could move at sustained speed, where the primary challenges of military movement were distance and weather rather than vertical geography. The canyon country of the Colorado Plateau was none of those things. It was a landscape of extraordinary vertical complexity, a place where a straight-line distance of 10 miles might require 40 miles of actual travel to cover, where a canyon that appeared narrow from the rim was half a mile wide at the bottom, where the difference between a passable trail and a fatal drop was sometimes a matter of inches and was almost never visible until you were already committed to a route. Army horses struggled in this terrain. The canyon trails were too narrow, too steep, and too irregular for sustained mounted movement. A horse that was reliable on open ground became a liability on a ledge trail at altitude, where one misstep meant a fall of several hundred feet. Soldiers who were experienced riders in conventional terrain became tentative and slow in the canyons, because their experience was telling them things that did not apply to where they were. The Army's solution to the communication problem in canyon country was essentially to go around it. Routes were planned along canyon rims rather than through canyon interiors, which kept the terrain manageable but added enormous distances to every journey. A message that needed to travel 20 miles in a straight line might follow a rim route of 60 or 70 miles to avoid the canyons between departure and destination. In urgent situations, this was not a solution. It was a delay. The Army also relied heavily on written communication, which required a literate courier who could protect a document through the journey, difficult in weather, in darkness, or in conditions where the courier might need both hands for the terrain. Verbal messages required a courier whose memory and accuracy could be trusted absolutely, which was a different kind of reliability requirement and one that the Army's courier system was not specifically designed to produce. The Navajo messenger system was designed around precisely these constraints. Not around them in the sense of accommodating them reluctantly, but around them in the sense that the canyon terrain itself had shaped the system from the beginning. The system did not treat the canyons as obstacles. It treated them as the medium through which movement happened, and it had been optimized for that medium over generations of use in exactly these conditions. The Army could not see this because it was still trying to apply its own framework to terrain that required an entirely different one. The canyon country of the Colorado Plateau is one of the most geographically complex landscapes on Earth. From the air, it looks like the ground has been torn apart and rearranged by a force that had no interest in human convenience. Canyons branch into side canyons that branch into smaller draws. Mesas rise and fall without pattern. Rock formations that appear identical from a distance are separated by impassable vertical drops. The scale is deceptive in every direction. Things that look close are far, and things that look far are sometimes reachable by routes that are invisible until you are on them. For a person who did not grow up in this landscape, navigation was a constant crisis. Every decision point required a judgment about terrain that could not be made without information the traveler did not have. Every route that appeared to continue might end at a cliff. Every canyon bottom that appeared to lead somewhere might box out into an impassable wall. The standard navigational tools, landmarks, direction, estimated distance, functioned poorly in a landscape where landmarks repeated themselves, direction was constantly subverted by terrain, and estimated distance bore no reliable relationship to actual travel time. The Navajo had grown up in this landscape. Not abstractly, not in the sense of having visited it or traveled through it, but in the sense of having been formed by it from childhood in the way that any person is formed by the specific physical world they grow up inside. The canyon country was not a place the Navajo navigated. It was a place they inhabited in the full sense of that word. A place whose features had names and histories and relationships to other features, a place whose moods and conditions they read continuously the way any person reads the environment they know intimately. A Navajo runner moving through canyon terrain was not navigating in the way that the Army understood navigation. He was not consulting a mental map and matching landmarks to positions. He was moving through a known environment with the automatic, integrated awareness that comes from having moved through the same environment hundreds or thousands of times. The same awareness that allows a person to walk through their own house in complete darkness without hesitation, because the space is known in a way that precedes conscious thought. The canyon features that were threats to Army scouts, the sudden drops, the narrowing trails, the branching side canyons, were known quantities to a Navajo runner. He knew which drops were there before he reached them because he had passed them before, because he had been taught where they were, because the land around them had features that signaled their presence to someone who knew what those signals meant. He was not moving through unknown terrain at remarkable speed. He was moving through known terrain at the speed that knowledge makes possible. And that speed was, to anyone watching from outside that knowledge, effectively incomprehensible. The physical capacity of the Navajo runners was not separate from their geographical knowledge. The two were developed together, from childhood, through a training system that produced a specific kind of human body optimized for a specific kind of movement in a specific kind of terrain. Running was not a skill that Navajo young men developed incidentally through general activity. It was trained deliberately and systematically. The accounts of Navajo running training documented by early ethnographers and military observers consistently describe a practice that began in early childhood and continued with increasing intensity through adolescence. Distance running in the specific terrain of the canyon country, often in conditions of cold, heat, and altitude that would have been considered extreme by any outside standard. Boys ran in the early morning, before dawn in many accounts, when the temperature was lowest and the body had to work hardest to maintain output. They ran uphill and downhill on terrain that required constant adjustment of stride, balance, and foot placement. They ran fasted, on empty stomachs, which trained the body to access fat as a fuel source rather than depending on readily available carbohydrates. a metabolic adaptation that is now understood to be significant for sustained endurance performance over long distances without food resupply. They also ran carrying weight. A messenger who needed to carry items, food, water, materials, could not slow to a walk under load without compromising the entire purpose of being a messenger. Training under load built the specific strength and endurance patterns required for loaded running in canyon terrain, where the demands on the body stabilizing muscles were far greater than on flat ground. The result of this training, sustained over years, was a body that was genuinely different in its capacities from the bodies of men who had not gone through it. Not different in some vague general sense, different in specific measurable ways. Lower resting heart rates. Greater efficiency of oxygen use at altitude, which was relevant in terrain that ranged from canyon bottoms to plateau rims at dramatically different elevations. Stronger stabilizing musculature in the ankles and knees, which allowed faster movement on irregular terrain without the injury risk that the same speed would have created in an untrained body. Army scouts who were considered fit and capable by every standard their training applied were watching men whose bodies had been built for a specific task by a training system that had been refining its methods for generations. They were seeing the output of that system without seeing the system itself, which made the output look like something other than what it was. The Navajo runners were not exceptionally gifted individuals who happened to be faster than other humans. Some were faster than others, as in any population. What they shared was not individual genius but collective preparation, a system that produced capable runners reliably, generation after generation, because the community understood that reliable communication across canyon terrain was not a convenience but a survival requirement. The Army could admire the output. It could not replicate it quickly because replicating it required beginning in childhood and sustaining the work for years. There was no shortcut. The body that could cross 40 miles of canyon terrain before dawn was not built in a training camp. It was built over a life. What made the Navajo messenger system faster than anything the Army could produce was not only the individual runner. It was the network the runner moved through. A single man running 40 miles of canyon terrain, regardless of his physical capacity or his geographical knowledge, has a ceiling on how fast he can travel. The human body has limits that cannot be exceeded by knowledge or training or determination. A message that needs to travel 100 miles faster than a single man can run it requires something other than a single man. The Navajo messenger system used relay. Runners did not carry messages end to end across the full distance. They carried messages to the next point in the network, a specific location known to the system where another runner waited or could be quickly reached. The message transferred, and the second runner continued to the next relay point, and so on across the full distance. This is the same principle that made the Pony Express famous in American history, the recognition that a series of fresh individuals moving at full capacity over shorter distances collectively covers ground faster than any single individual moving over the full distance. But the Pony Express required infrastructure: way stations, horses, employees, supply lines, capital. It required the apparatus of an organization with resources. The Navajo relay system required knowledge. The relay points were not buildings. They were locations, specific features in the canyon landscape that were known to the network, that were reachable by runners from multiple directions, and that had the characteristics needed to function as transfer points. A spring where a waiting runner would find the arriving runner hydrated. A canyon junction where routes from multiple directions converged. A rock formation visible from multiple approaches that served as a landmark for the exchange. The network existed in the knowledge of the people who used it. It had no physical infrastructure that an outside observer could identify. Army officers moving through Navajo territory and looking for the mechanism behind the messenger system's speed saw nothing, because the mechanism was not a thing. It was a shared understanding held in the minds of the runners and the communities that supported them, of where the network existed and how it worked. The relay points shifted seasonally. Routes that were optimal in summer, when certain canyon bottoms were dry and passable, were not optimal in spring, when the same bottoms might be running with snowmelt. The network adapted continuously to conditions rather than remaining fixed to infrastructure that conditions might compromise. When a relay point became unusable, it was replaced by a different location that served the same function under the current conditions. This adaptability was possible because the system was knowledge-based rather than infrastructure-based. Knowledge can be updated instantly, while infrastructure requires physical reconstruction. The Army built roads and established way stations. The Navajo messenger network had no roads and no stations. What it had was something the Army could not build quickly and could not map and could not replicate without the foundational knowledge that made it function. It was a communication system that existed entirely inside the understanding of the people who used it, and it was faster than anything the Army could field in that terrain precisely because of that quality. The detail in David Foster's journal entry that most confounded him was not that the runner had covered 40 miles quickly. It was that the runner had done it at night. This specific detail, movement at night, alone in canyon terrain, was the point at which Foster's framework for understanding what he was witnessing broke down entirely. He was an experienced frontier officer. He had traveled extensively in difficult terrain. He knew what darkness did to a person's ability to navigate, to assess terrain, to move safely. He knew that the canyon country at night was a different environment from the canyon country in daylight. One where the depth cues that allowed a person to judge distance from an edge, the color contrast that distinguished trail from drop, and the spatial reference points that made navigation possible were all dramatically reduced or eliminated. He knew this because he had experienced the canyon country at night himself and found it impassable without a fire or a moon bright enough to cast shadows. The darkness was not simply an inconvenience in this terrain. It was a transformation of the environment into something that required fundamentally different navigation strategies, or, in the Army's experience, made navigation impossible and required stopping and waiting for light. The Navajo runners moved through it without stopping. The explanation has several components, and they work together rather than independently. The first is memorization at a level that the Army's use of terrain did not require and therefore did not develop. A Navajo runner who had traveled a route many times had memorized not just the general direction and major features but the specific texture of the trail under his feet at every point, where it widened, where it narrowed, where it turned, where the surface changed from rock to sand to packed earth and back again. In darkness, this tactile memory became a navigational instrument. The ground told him where he was and what was coming, not visually but through his feet and his body's accumulated knowledge of how the trail felt at every point along it. The second component was celestial navigation. The canyon country sky at night, away from any artificial light source, is extraordinarily clear. Stars are bright enough to cast faint shadows. A runner who knew the sky, who had been taught to read star positions and movements as navigational reference points, had access to directional information that did not depend on seeing the ground. The combination of sky navigation and trail memory created a system that functioned in darkness at a level that was simply not available to someone without both elements. The third component was an understanding of how sound moved through canyon terrain at night. Canyons amplify and redirect sound in ways that daylight masks. The echo patterns from a runner's own footsteps, from wind moving through specific formations, from water moving in canyon bottoms, all provided spatial information about the environment that an experienced ear could read as effectively as a visual impression. None of this was magic. All of it was knowledge. But to someone standing in darkness in canyon country, unable to move safely in any direction, watching a man disappear into the dark at a steady run, it looked like something else entirely. If you are finding this as fascinating as I am, leave a comment below telling me which part of this surprised you most. The running, the network, or the navigation in the dark. I read every single one. The single most important perceptual shift required to understand the Navajo messenger system is this. The Army saw the canyon country as terrain to be overcome. The Navajo saw it as a road. Not a road in the sense of a constructed surface for vehicle movement. A road in the sense of a structured network of routes that connected places in predictable ways and could be traveled reliably by people who understood the network. The canyons were not obstacles interrupting a journey. They were the channels through which the journey moved. Understanding this distinction changes everything about how the speed and reliability of Navajo messengers makes sense. Canyon bottoms, for a person who knows them, offer significant advantages over rim travel. The temperature in a canyon bottom is more stable than on an exposed rim, where wind and sun create extremes in both directions. The footing in a canyon bottom, while irregular, is protected from the wind that makes exposed rim trails more treacherous. Canyon bottom routes follow water, which means they pass reliable hydration points that rim routes do not. And canyon bottoms, precisely because they are the channels through which water moves, tend to be continuous. They lead somewhere rather than ending arbitrarily, which makes them more reliable as route corridors than rim terrain, which can be broken by side canyons and geological irregularities at unpredictable intervals. The Army avoided canyon bottoms because entering a canyon meant commitment, committing to a route that might not exit where you needed it to exit, in a terrain where retracing steps was costly and sometimes impossible. This was a rational assessment for a force that did not know the canyons. For a person who knew every exit from every canyon on a route, this commitment was not a risk. It was an advantage. The canyon bottom was faster and more reliable than the rim, and the only thing that made it so was knowing where the exits were. The Navajo runners knew where every exit was. They knew because they had used them, because they had been taught them, because the exits were part of the geographical knowledge that the community maintained and transmitted with the same care that a maritime culture maintains knowledge of harbor approaches and tidal channels. Specific canyon routes had names. They had histories. They had associated knowledge, what the route was like in different seasons, where it offered shelter, where it had water, where it required particular caution. This named, historied, detailed knowledge of specific routes was the foundation on which the messenger network operated, and it was knowledge that had been accumulating for generations before the Army arrived to observe its results. Army cartographers who attempted to map the canyon country in this period consistently noted that their maps, however carefully made, failed to capture the actual navigability of the terrain. They showed the shape of the canyons but not the specific features that made certain routes practical and others impassable. The Navajo did not need maps. The information that maps tried to represent existed in the knowledge of the people, distributed across the community, constantly updated, and available to any runner who had completed the long process of learning the system from the people who already knew it. The messages themselves require explanation, because they add another layer to what the Army found so difficult to understand. The Navajo messenger system did not rely on written communication. The culture was oral, not in the sense of being without complex communication, but in the sense of having developed communication systems that did not use writing as their primary medium. Messages were carried verbally, held in memory, and delivered with an accuracy that multiple military observers documented as precise enough to be relied upon for sensitive operational information. This challenged the Army's assumptions about verbal communication in a fundamental way. The Army used written orders precisely because it did not trust verbal transmission for complex or precise information. The telephone game principle, the understanding that verbal messages degrade through repetition and transmission, was built into military communication doctrine as a reason to commit important information to writing whenever possible. The Navajo messenger system produced verbal transmission that did not degrade in this way, and the reason it did not was memory training that was as systematic and deliberate as the physical training of the runners' bodies. Memory in an oral culture is not the passive retention of information as it is understood in a literate culture. It is an active skill, trained through specific techniques that use structure, rhythm, and association to encode information in ways that make it stable across repeated retrieval. The specific techniques used varied across different oral traditions, but the underlying principle was consistent. Information encoded with structural regularity, rhythmic pattern, or strong associative anchors is retained more accurately and retrieved more reliably than information carried as undifferentiated content. A Navajo runner receiving a message was not simply hearing words and hoping to remember them. He was receiving information that had been formulated, or that he was formulating in receipt, in a way that encoded it for stable retention. The message was structured so that it could be held intact through the physical demands of the journey, the exertion, the navigation, the environmental conditions, and delivered at the destination with the accuracy that the system required. This was a trained skill. The same runners who were physically capable of crossing canyon terrain at night were trained to hold complex verbal messages intact through that crossing. The physical and cognitive demands were understood as inseparable parts of the same task, and the preparation for both was conducted simultaneously. Army officers who tested Navajo messengers' accuracy, sometimes by sending a known message and then checking the delivery against a written version, consistently reported accuracy that they found remarkable. The information arrived intact. The details were correct. The sequence was preserved. The written order and the verbal message were not equivalent in the Army's experience. They were equivalent in the Navajo messenger system, because the cognitive infrastructure that supported verbal transmission in that system had been built to produce equivalence. It was not a lesser form of communication. It was a different form, built to a standard that the Army's assumptions about memory and oral transmission had not prepared it to recognize. David Foster was not the only Army officer who found the Navajo messenger system impossible to dismiss. He was part of a small group of men who served in the canyon country long enough and honestly enough to recognize that what they were witnessing was not luck or exaggeration but a genuine operational capability that exceeded anything their own force could produce in that terrain. John Gregory Burke, who appears in multiple accounts of indigenous knowledge from this period, documented the Navajo runner system in enough detail that his notes remain a primary historical source. Burke was unusual among military observers of his era in that he approached what he witnessed with the curiosity of someone who wanted to understand the mechanism rather than simply note the outcome. He asked questions. He spent time with the scouts and runners attached to the columns he traveled with. He recorded not just what he saw but what he was told about how it worked. Burke documented the relay system explicitly, the understanding that no single runner carried a message the full distance in most cases, and that the speed of the system came from the coordination of multiple runners moving at full capacity over segments of the route rather than from any individual's ability to sustain superhuman output over the full distance. This was, he noted, a more efficient use of human capacity than any communication system the Army had developed for irregular terrain. He also documented his attempts to understand the geographical knowledge of the runners, the conversations, through interpreters, in which he tried to establish how a runner navigated specific sections of terrain that Burke himself had found impassable or nearly so. The answers he received were consistently variations on a theme. The runner knew the terrain because the terrain was known to him. The specific features that Burke experienced as threats were experienced by the runner as familiar landmarks. The darkness that Burke found blinding was darkness through which the runner moved using information Burke had not been trained to access. Burke was honest about the limits of his understanding. He could document what he observed and what he was told. He could not, he wrote, fully reconstruct the internal experience of movement through terrain you have known your entire life, in darkness, guided by memory and sky and the feel of the ground under your feet. He had not grown up in that landscape and he had not built that knowledge over a lifetime and he could not acquire it quickly enough to verify it from the inside. What he could do, and did, was resist the temptation to dismiss it. He was a scientist in the field as much as a soldier, and his scientific instinct told him that the outcomes he was observing required explanation rather than dismissal. The runners were faster than they should have been. The messages arrived intact when they should have degraded. The routes they used were routes that his maps had not recorded and his scouts had not found. The explanation was knowledge. Burke knew that. He documented it clearly and honestly. And his documentation, preserved in the historical record, is part of why we can speak with confidence today about what that knowledge actually was. The speed of the Navajo messenger system was not a curiosity or an athletic achievement. It was, in the years when it operated at full capacity, a matter of survival for the communities it served. The canyon country of the Colorado Plateau was not only a challenging landscape for movement. It was, during the period of American military expansion into the Southwest, a landscape under military pressure. The Navajo were not living in the canyon country in peaceful isolation. They were living in territory that the U.S. government was actively attempting to control, with a military campaign, Kit Carson's campaign of 1863 and 1864, specifically aimed at forcing relocation. In this context, the ability to move information faster than the Army could anticipate or respond to was not an advantage. It was a defensive necessity. A community that knew a military column was moving toward it had time to prepare, to move, to make decisions. A community that received no warning had no time at all. The Navajo messenger system, in the years before the Long Walk, was functioning as an early warning network as much as a communication system. Runners were not only carrying messages between fixed points. They were carrying information about Army movements, about the locations of columns, about the timing and direction of campaigns. This information moved through the canyon country faster than the Army moved, which meant that communities in the network's reach had warning time that communities without such a network did not have. This operational reality gives the messenger system a dimension that pure descriptions of physical capability miss. The runners who crossed 40 miles of canyon terrain before dawn were not performing an athletic demonstration. They were carrying information that might determine whether a family had time to move their sheep and their children or whether they were still in a canyon when the soldiers arrived. The stakes were not abstract. They were the survival of specific communities in a specific moment of historical violence. The system's speed was not remarkable for its own sake. It was remarkable because the situation required it, because the alternative to a fast message was a slow one, and a slow message in the autumn of 1863 meant something that no amount of canyon knowledge could remedy afterward. This context does not make the physical and cognitive achievement of the runners less impressive. It makes it more so because the pressure under which the system operated was not the pressure of a demonstration or a competition. It was the pressure of consequence, real, irreversible human consequence, that gave the system its urgency and its meaning. The specific capacities of the Navajo runners, their endurance, their navigational ability in darkness, their memory accuracy under physical stress, have all been studied in contexts that allow modern verification of what historical observers documented. The endurance capacity of sustained trained distance runners operating at altitude in irregular terrain has been documented extensively in modern sports science. The key findings consistently confirm what the historical accounts describe. Training that begins in childhood and continues through adolescence produces physiological adaptations, increased mitochondrial density, improved fat oxidation, greater efficiency of oxygen use, that are not achievable through training begun in adulthood. The runners produced by the Navajo training system were the product of developmental windows that adult military training could not access. Their capacity was built into their physiology at a level that could not be replicated quickly by men whose bodies had been built for different demands. The navigational capacity in darkness has been studied through research on spatial memory and tactile navigation in people who are either blind or trained in low-light movement. The findings confirm that spatial memory of a known environment can substitute effectively for visual information, that a person who knows a route intimately can navigate it in conditions of significantly reduced visibility using the combination of memory, proprioception, and auditory information that Navajo runners used in the canyons. This is not a mystical ability. It is a trained one, and training in low-light navigation specifically produces better low-light navigation, exactly as training in any other skill produces better performance of that skill. The memory accuracy of trained oral transmitters has been studied through comparative analysis of oral traditions and cultures that maintained complex information through verbal transmission without writing. The findings consistently show that trained oral transmission, using the structural and mnemonic techniques developed by oral cultures, produces accuracy rates substantially higher than untrained verbal communication, high enough to be reliable for complex and precise information. The Army's assumption that verbal transmission was inherently less accurate than written transmission was accurate for untrained verbal transmission. It was not accurate for the trained verbal transmission that the Navajo messenger system used. Every element of what the Army found baffling turns out, under examination, to be explicable. Not through exceptional individual talent, not through cultural mystery, but through systematic training of specific capacities over the appropriate developmental timeline, applied in the specific environment for which the training was designed. The results looked impossible because the preparation was invisible. The preparation was invisible because it happened over a lifetime, distributed across a community, in a landscape that the Army was still learning to see. David Foster spent 3 years in the canyon country of the Colorado Plateau after the autumn night when he watched Hashka's runner disappear into the darkness with a message that reached Fort Defiance before dawn. In that time he traveled with Navajo scouts on dozens of missions. He watched runners move through terrain that his own body told him was impassable at the speeds they were moving. He carried written orders and watched verbal messages arrive with the same precision. He attempted to learn the canyon routes he traveled most frequently and found that his retention of them improved slowly, imperfectly, and only for routes he had traveled many times in good conditions. Nothing approaching the fluency with which the runners moved through the full range of terrain in all conditions. He asked questions. His interpreter translated, imperfectly, the answers he received. He took notes. He tried to understand not just what the runners did but how they understood what they did, what it felt like, from the inside, to be a person for whom the canyon country was not a challenge to be overcome but a known environment to be moved through. The answers he received, filtered through translation and across a cultural gap that his questions could not fully bridge, came back to the same place repeatedly. The canyon was not difficult to the runner the way it was difficult to Foster because the runner knew it. Not knew it in the way Foster knew the street he had grown up on, recognizable in daylight, navigable from memory but with effort. Knew it the way Foster knew his own body, immediately, automatically, without conscious calculation, as an extension of himself. Foster wrote in his final journal entry from the canyon country that he believed the runners did not experience the landscape the way he experienced it. Not because they were different kinds of humans, but because they had spent their lives in a relationship with that specific place that had made the place part of them in a way that his few years of travel through it had not begun to replicate. The canyon was not something they moved through. It was something they moved within. The distinction was everything. He left the Southwest in 1866 and returned to a career in the Eastern Army. He never went back to the canyon country. But in the memoir he wrote late in his life, unpublished, found among his papers by his family, and eventually donated to a historical archive where it sat largely unread for decades, he returned to that autumn night in 1863. To Hashka's quiet words. To the young runner moving off into the dark at a pace that looked almost casual. To the confirmation arriving before dawn that the message had reached its destination. He wrote, "I have spent the remainder of my career around men who considered themselves experts in movement and terrain. None of them could have done what that young man did on that night. Not for lack of courage or strength or intelligence. For lack of a life spent in that canyon, learning what it had to teach. If something in this story stayed with you, the runner disappearing into dark canyon terrain, the network that existed only in knowledge, the messages that arrived intact when they should have been lost, or the officer who spent 3 years trying to understand what he had seen in one night, leave it below. Because stories like this one exist at the edge of what we think is possible. And that edge is always worth exploring.